to this episode of Oral History of Evidence Synthesis and Evidence-Based Medicine. This is one of the two series that we started to document the technological and methodological developments in our field. We document the past, present, and the futures for all generations of evidence synthesizers or systematic reviewers. Our guest today is Carol Lefebvre, the first information specialist in the Cochrane Collaboration and the lead author of the Searching for and Selecting Studies chapter in the Cochrane Handbook for Systematic Reviews of Interventions. Carol, if I may, hello and welcome. Thank you for accepting my invitation for this interview, and please tell us your story and mainly the story before the first Cochrane meeting.
Thank you, Farad. Thank you for the invitation. And I think it's a very exciting series that you're producing. So I'm looking forward to seeing some of the other videos. I guess my story starts when I graduated in 1980, I guess it must have been, and started work in a bookshop in Bedford, where I lived, worked there for a few years and was approached by the librarian of Cranfield University, as it's now called, to ask whether I wanted to become a library assistant there with a view to becoming a librarian. And he said, it doesn't matter whether you want to become a librarian or not. If you're interested in the job, you can just do the job. And if you then want to go to library school, you can. So I decided that that would probably be a career path I'd be interested in. So I applied for the job at Cranfield and was offered it, and decided that I definitely did want to become a librarian stroke information scientist, as we called it in those days. So I worked at Cranfield in a pre-qualification role as a library assistant, as I say, for nearly 2 years. And then I did my master's degree and MSc at Loughborough University. So when I had qualified as a librarian, my first professional post was at the University of Oxford Medical School Library at the John Radcliffe Hospital, which you may have heard of. And I became the deputy librarian there. My official title was Information Services Librarian, so I was responsible for searching. In those days, searching meant that people had to make an appointment with me because I was the only one that had the equipment, a huge, great modem the size of a suitcase underneath my desk. This was before the days of personal computers and what have you. And one of those old-fashioned little printers, the dot matrix printers. But of course, the results all came from Switzerland by airmail, as you probably know. So this was the very, very early days of searching. So that really was the start. And I worked there until the Cochrane Centre was founded. So that was my background.
Very comprehensive and summative and informative. Thank you. And how did you get involved in the first systematic review and the Cochrane Collaboration? I'm not sure if those two are the same.
Right. Well, how I got involved in the Cochrane Collaboration, I think I probably have your ex-boss as the coordinating editor of the schizophrenia group to thank for this, Farad. When Iain Chalmers was wanting to set up the Cochrane Centre, as it was called in those days, it wasn't the UK Cochrane Centre because, of course, it was the only one. But when Iain Chalmers was wanting to set up the Cochrane Centre, he knew me because I used to provide the Swiss printouts for him for the National Perinatal Epidemiology Unit for his work on pregnancy and childbirth. He asked me if I would serve on the interview panel to appoint an information specialist for the Cochrane Centre. And whether I would help them draft the job description and so on and so forth. And so, of course, I thought this was a very reasonable request, and I accepted this, and I met many times with one of his colleagues, Sally Hunt, to draft the job description and so on and so forth. But never, of course, did it occur to me that I might want to apply for the job myself. For a start, the salary was ridiculously low, to be absolutely honest. It was a short-term post. I forget now whether it was 3 years or 5 years, but it was obviously connected to the grant. And I had academic tenure at the University of Oxford. So why on earth would I give up a tenured position for a post that was only going to be 3 to 5 years and was paying a ridiculous amount of money? And I think also at that time, my husband had just become self-employed. He just set up his own company. So the idea of me sort of going out on a limb like this at that time would have seemed extraordinary, let me put it that way. Until Clive came to see me one day. I don't know whether it was on the pretext of wanting to talk about a search, but anyway, he came to see me to talk about searching. And when we talked about what we needed to talk about, he said, "Oh, that's a really nice job that Ian's advertising there, isn't it?" And I said, "Oh, yes." I said, "I think it'll be a really nice opportunity for somebody. I'm helping him with the selection." He said, "Oh," he said, "I think that would be a really nice job for you." And I said, "Oh, no, I don't think so." I probably didn't share with Clive the reasons at the time, but I said, "No, no," I said, "I'm just helping them out." But after Clive had left, I began to think that apart from all the disadvantages, which I've already outlined, I began to think that this was a really amazing opportunity for somebody. And it could be an amazing opportunity for me if only we could get over these hurdles. So once that thought had passed my mind, I instantly contacted Iain Chalmers and said, "I'm very sorry to say that I'm going to have to withdraw from the selection panel. I can't give you any more assistance on drafting the advert. The thought has passed my mind that I might apply for the post. And as soon as that thought has passed my mind, whether I do or not, I cannot give you any more advice or support, but I wish you every success with the post," and so on and so forth. So that was that. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, perhaps some of these hurdles can be overcome. Obviously, the limit of the 3 to 5 years could not. But I was told that the salary could possibly be overcome, and my husband and I discussed it. So I decided to apply for it. So that was how I came to apply for the post of information specialist at the UK Cochrane Centre, and I was appointed. The Cochrane Centre opened in October 1992. I had to give 3 months' notice, obviously, as an academic post at the university, and I started mid-November.
Wow. I had no idea about it. I don't think many people were aware of this history. And what was that how you got involved in the first systematic review as well, or you were already working on systematic reviews? Because you mentioned that you were providing search services as part of information services.
Right. I wasn't involved in any systematic reviews at that point. Systematic reviews were very rare in those days, Farhad, as you probably know. So my involvement in systematic reviews, as far as I'm aware, the only group for whom I was actually providing literature results was Iain Chalmers' group at the perinatal unit. And I hadn't designed this was an alert. I hadn't designed that search strategy. That had been designed by, I think, probably Steve Pritchard, a librarian in Cardiff who'd worked with Archie Cochrane all those years ago. But certainly I hadn't designed that search. I simply provided the monthly updates. So supporting systematic reviews wasn't something that was happening in that era.
Very interesting. And were you the only information specialist, information professional in Cochrane in the early days, or there
Yeah.
were others as well, and you started employing more?
No, I was the only information specialist in Cochrane until we got a grant from the European Union under the Biomed programme. We got something like £250,000 to identify general healthcare journal reported RCTs across Europe. And as soon as we got that money in, it was agreed that I should appoint a research assistant, a recently qualified or early career research assistant, qualified information specialist, to work with me. And that was how Steve McDonald came to join Cochrane. So he was my first research assistant at the UK Cochrane Centre. I don't think I mentioned that we realised in 1993 that we wanted there to be other Cochrane centres. So we changed our name from the Cochrane Centre to the UK Cochrane Centre to enable other centres in other parts of the world to call themselves, I don't know, the French Cochrane Centre or the German Cochrane Centre or whatever, the Dutch Cochrane Centre.
Very interesting. Steve is now in Australia and still very active in our field.
Absolutely, yes. He started life in 1995 as a research assistant, and for many years now, he's been the co-director of Cochrane Australia. So yes, he's one of Cochrane's great success stories.
Yes, actually, he's on my list probably
Oh, good.
next couple of months.
Yeah.
So there was no Cochrane Handbooks, no Prisma, no Prisma-Search, no press. Um, so there were no really guidelines on how to do searches for the systematic reviews. What were you doing then?
Right. My role was very much defined as building central. I was hired. I've got the quote here somewhere. Yeah, I was hired in my job description. It said that I was hired to build an international register of randomized controlled trials in healthcare. That was my clearly not single-handedly, I must add, but that was my focus. So my focus was, if you like, big picture. It wasn't supporting particular systematic reviews or looking for trials in a certain area. So I've already mentioned the sort of pan-European project which I led, which we started in 1993. I think probably the grant funding came through in 94. And after that project had finished, we then applied for another grant to do a similar project in specialised healthcare journals across Europe. So the first project had been things like the British Medical Journal, the Lancet, Deutsche Medizinische Wochenschrift, and all the equivalents in other parts of Europe. The second one had been, as I say, the specialised journals across Europe. So I was very big picture, if you like. But then, obviously, the pregnancy and childbirth activity was ongoing. Iain Chalmers had brought that over from the National Perinatal Epidemiology Unit, and they continued to create what then became Cochrane Reviews in that area. Then obviously the stroke group started. I'm not sure if stroke was next. Neonatal was another very early one. So these groups then started doing their own systematic reviews. But I wasn't associated with those groups in their own, specific areas. As I say, I was responsible for the bigger picture of building central.
Very interesting. And was that how you and other colleagues started thinking about a randomized control trials search filter? And what did it started happening in Canada or the UK? Because they have their own filter as well. Whose idea was to develop something and validate it? Because it seems that RCT filter is the first one.
Right. Yes. So certainly Brian Haynes' team at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, as you say, had been working for some years in what they called hedges, but we these days would call filters. And I think, to be honest, even they now call them filters. But yes, they had been working in this field, and I think they had four distinct, should we call them, because specific has a different meaning within information retrieval. They had four, if I remember correctly, or more distinct filters. They had one, for example, that they called therapy. But if you read the small print, their definition of therapy is not only that the patients have to be randomized, which of course wouldn't necessarily meet everybody else's definition of therapy, but it was the definition that they used for the ACP Journal Club. So the patients or participants had to be randomized, but there were also other criteria attached to that. I forget exactly what they were now, but one, for example, was follow-up. So the patients had to be followed up for X period of time. Well, in Cochrane, we didn't want that. We wanted randomized or quasi-randomized studies, irrespective of all other criteria, apart from the fact that they had to be in humans. And that was one of the very first things that we did within Cochrane. As I say, Cochrane opened on the 1st of October 1992, and I joined them in mid-November. I forget the date now. It was a Monday in mid-November was the official opening of the Cochrane Centre. And so we had the great and the good worldwide come in for this meeting. I can't remember how many people were there. But Iain Chalmers, not one to miss an opportunity, as I'm sure you'll know, a very driven man. And the world has much to be thankful for how driven he has been over the decades. Not one to miss an opportunity, he decided that on the Sunday before the official opening on the Monday, we would have a full day meeting on the subject of building an international register of RCTs. So we had this meeting on Sunday, met all day down in what I think it was Green College. It was down in one of the colleges in Oxford. And that was where we came up with the definitions that you now see in the Cochrane Handbook for randomized controlled trial. So I'm sure you're familiar with those, but that definition was set in stone in November 1992 and has never changed since. This was before the National Library of Medicine had a publication type for controlled clinical trial, which we prefer to refer to as quasi-randomized study. But that was how we started with that.
Wow.
And sorry, you'd asked me about the handbook. So what we basically had in the early 90s was just a document which I think it was an internal document within Cochrane, and Cochrane was very small in those days. It was an internal document which Kay Dickerson and I had written, and it was called something like Establishing and Maintaining Specialised Registers, and it was a document that was meant as guidance for the Cochrane review groups coming online to help them establish and maintain registers. Because in the early days of searching, certainly with the stroke group, they weren't searching for studies to populate specific reviews. They were attempting to build an all-encompassing register in the same way as the perinatal group had done with ODPOT, it was called, the Oxford Database of Perinatal Trials. So the stroke group and some of the other early groups tried to follow this example where they would have an all-encompassing specialized register, so their searches of the various databases would be very, very broad. And then from this register, they would then search within the register on keywords that they had assigned to identify the studies for the particular reviews that they were working on. So very much following the pregnancy and childbirth model. So they didn't need, in the early days, qualified information specialists to design one search after another for specific interventions in the way that most groups operated latterly. So that was the Cochrane Handbook in the early days, but obviously that's developed very much over time, as you'll be aware. And I think there are now the two sections. There's the main section within the main handbook, and then there's a technical supplement, and both of them run to about 100 pages. So and with about 10 authors. So very much more detailed work now.
That nicely brings me to the next question, which is the story of Cochrane Handbook, how it started, the first edition, the second edition, and many may not know, the current living edition of Cochrane Handbook.
Right, yes, I saw in advance of your question that you were referring to it as living. I'm not sure that I would refer to it as living. I think that within the evidence synthesis community, we've become a little bit too keen to use the word living. I think when when the idea of living systematic reviews first came out, which is many years ago now, people were very excited, and quite rightly, very excited about the proposal that you would update a systematic review immediately when new evidence became available. But as you're probably aware, many of these supposedly living systematic reviews have not been living systematic reviews at all because of the workload required. Same goes for living guidelines. And so what they have actually become is more frequently updated systematic reviews than they might have been if they hadn't been called living, let's put it that way. So I would not call the Cochrane Handbook a living handbook, in the sense that a decision was taken probably about 5 years ago now that we should update it annually. So that was a very specific time point, not living. But more recently, because of course there's a lot of work involved in updating it annually, the editors are trying to move towards a position whereby you update it when new evidence becomes available. But of course, the flaw with that argument, if I may say, with respect to the two lead editors, the flaw with that argument is it's only when you've actually read the studies and drawn a conclusion from the studies that you know or not whether that's likely to produce new evidence. And by then you've done all the work, and you're obviously wanting to get that published. So we're sort of at the stage of discussing how we take that forward. But for the last 5 years or so, it has been updated on a strictly annual policy to be published in September of each year.
Which makes it the most up-to-date guide to the systematic reviewing, I think.
Oh, I agree. Yes, I agree. I'm not wanting to be too negative about your reference to living, but I feel I would like to define it slightly differently, so as people don't think that as soon as a new study comes out, we publish yet another chapter of the Cochrane Handbook that they've got to get their heads around.
Yes, the methodological development is so rapid. It is, I mean, for individuals, it is impossible to catch up with all the developments. So, annual update to Cochrane Handbook is extremely helpful.
Yeah.
I don't know if many people read it because it's a reference book. So I think people refer to it whenever they need, which makes it really useful. How about the Cochrane Library? So it is started on floppy disk, and did Cochrane Library include both systematic reviews and central in one place when it started, or was it just systematic reviews and then later it became CD, and so it included RCTs as well?
Right. What happened first was the Cochrane database of systematic reviews, and that was published first, mid-90s, I forget the date, but it was published as the Cochrane database of systematic reviews and known as CDSR. It was then decided that it would be a good idea to have the Cochrane Controlled Trials Register, as it was called. When we were ready to publish that, it was decided that it would be a good idea to publish that jointly with CDSR and put them all in one product. And so Mark Starr, who was the director of Update Software at the time, and his colleague Gordon Dooley, they decided that it would be best to name the product the Cochrane Library. And the inference was that it was a library of resources. So there would be more than one resource in there. So not just CDSR, but, for example, the Cochrane Controlled Trials Register. So that was how the Cochrane Controlled Trials Register, as it was called in those days, became part of the Cochrane Library. So yes, I was very heavily involved in Central, as I've already explained. That was my key purpose in life, from the point of view of Cochrane, but obviously not particularly involved in CDSR. As I say, it was up to the review groups, the early review groups, to publish their reviews, and they went about it in the way that we've already talked about.
So when the groups started, now there were more information specialists, information professionals, librarians involved, and then Cochrane Information Retrieval and Management Group, IRMG,
Yeah.
started. And was that the first methodological group?
No, no, it wasn't. But let me take you back a step, if I may, Farhad, and then we can come on to that. In the early days, the Cochrane groups didn't appoint information specialists. It was more likely that they would appoint scientists. Because, as I say, taking the stroke group as an example, because they were the first group to appoint a scientist in what was called in those days the trials search coordinator role. They appointed a scientist who was very, very experienced in science, and I think had some background that meant that the area of stroke was also familiar to her. But she wasn't an information scientist, but she didn't need to be because she wasn't designing search strategies. They'd hired in an information specialist, Justus Krabshus. I don't know whether you know of him, but he ran a consultancy company called Highland Data, and he did a lot of work with Elsevier on Embase, particularly in the crofting communities up in the north of Scotland, where these people in their crofts up in the Highlands did the work. So they hired him in to design the various different search strategies, if I remember correctly, on DataStar. And he set up a search strategy on each of the databases that they needed to feed their specialised register. So it was anything to do with stroke. So he set up search strategies in the same way as Steve Pritchard had set them up for pregnancy and childbirth. So they didn't need somebody within the review group who was an information specialist because they weren't designing search strategies on a review by review basis. So the early TSCs were not information specialists or medical librarians. They were, as I say, scientists. And it was only, and for example, Karen Welsh is another one. She has a PhD, I forget what topic, but I think it was she was experienced in the field of peripheral vascular disease. And she was hired in to do this similar kind of work for the PVD group. And ENT hired a nurse, Liz Dooley, who is still with Cochrane. Dymphna Hellmans was with the dementia group, again, a scientist, PhD, but not an information specialist. So it was a little bit further down the line that it became clear that for some of the review groups that were developing, they felt that they could never have an all-encompassing specialised register, that they were going to have to do review-specific searches, and for this they needed information specialists. So that transition came a little later. But I took you off track. You were asking me, I think, about the information retrieval methods group and the history of that. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, I guess the prehistory, if you like, of the Information Retrievals Methods Group was the first Cochrane colloquium was held at McMaster in Hamilton, Ontario in 1994. And I stayed on for a day or two to meet up with Brian Haynes' team, the team we've been talking about, to talk about their work in hedges, development, and so on. And Anne McKibben and I came up with this idea for a special interest group within Cochrane for librarians and information specialists, because, as I say, in those days, positions such as ours, and to be honest, I'm not even sure whether any of the scientists at McMaster were information specialists. I think they might all have just been scientists who'd gone into that as an area of activity. I'm not sure any of them were qualified as information specialists, but we could see that there was going to be a role for information specialists, and also there was a great need to train medical librarians working out in the community, to train them and make them aware of what systematic reviews were, because systematic reviews were being done within and outside of Cochrane, and librarians were doing the searches, not really knowing how different the searches needed to be for systematic reviews from normal clinical care. So Anne and I were very aware that we needed somehow to bring together within Cochrane, in particular this group, and came up with a draft proposal for a special interest group. And I discussed it with Iain Chalmers on my return, but he was not very happy with this because we had branded it as a special interest group, and he said he didn't want silos within Cochrane. He wanted people to work across disciplines, which I fully understood, and so we let it drop. That was the end of it. And then I think he must have been in conversation with Steve Pritchard at Cardiff. And before we know where we are, there's a proposal for there to be an information retrieval methods group. And it absolutely wasn't one of the earliest ones, not at all. So I was delighted, of course, when he said that, yes, he thought we should have this. And I think Steve and I were the original conveners of the group. We went through all the procedure that you have to go through in Cochrane to get any group set up. So yes, so that was what we did. And I think one of the first things we got involved with was the handbook chapter, the searching for studies, searching for and selecting studies as it is now. That's written on behalf of the information retrieval methods group. And when there are major revisions, it goes out for consultation. So the handbook is one of the main things. We also produced standard author training materials, as they were called, SATMs, which then developed into the Cochrane Interactive Learning Materials. And of course, it was the Information Retrieval Methods group that led the development of the methodological conduct standards and reporting standards, known as MESSIA, the methodological expectations for Cochrane intervention reviews. The reporting standards have been dropped, as you probably know, in favour of the new PRISMA, which Cochrane, I think, was heavily involved in the new PRISMA, so felt that they didn't need to have the MESSIA reporting standards, but the MESSIA conduct standards still stand. And now, of course, we have a discussion list for exchange of experience, exchange of ideas, and for communicating. So that, I think, basically is the major contributions. Oh, and I should mention, we also wrote an article to celebrate 20 years of Cochrane. So that would have been in 2013. I've got a copy here somewhere. Yes, it was published in Systematic Reviews in 2013, Methodological Developments in Searching for Studies for Systematic Reviews, the Past, the Present and the Future. So a lot of what we've been talking about is actually in that paper.
Yes, hopefully people will one day read it. I don't see many people studying these papers nowadays because everyone is busy and there are lots of things happening.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you. Thank you for introducing that paper. I've read it, obviously. But you have left your tenured job to get this 3-year position. And you've been in Cochrane and wider systematic review community for over 30 years now.
Yeah.
What keeps you motivated to continue this career path? And have you ever had this other thought of changing your path, or do you have any regrets?
No, not at all. I think I've got the best job ever. When I went for my interview, I can remember saying to the interview panel, which was Iain Chalmers, Muir Gray, and I regret I can't remember who else was on the panel, but they said to me, what makes you want to come and do this job? And I said, well, I thought that this was how medicine already worked. I thought that that medical decisions taken by doctors and other clinicians were already based on the best available evidence. And I said, I'm really horrified to hear that that's not actually what's happening. And I really felt that I could make a difference. When we started Cochrane, there were only 3 professionally qualified people in Cochrane worldwide. Literally the 3 of us. There was Iain Chalmers, obviously a perinatologist, as the director of the centre. There was Andrew Herxheimer, a clinical pharmacologist, and myself. That was Cochrane. And the fact that Cochrane had decided that they wanted, of their 3 professionally qualified members of staff, they wanted one of them to be an information specialist. I felt that really made it very, very clear how important the skills of an information specialist were to them. And I think that has always held true, that information specialists have always been held in very high regard in Cochrane. They've always been considered equal members of the team. You yourself obviously worked as an information specialist within the schizophrenia group. And I hope that your experience there was also that your skills were valued just as the skills of any other methodologist within the team.
Yes, I had the same feeling, and the environment was very welcoming, thanks to you and the other colleagues who created that environment. Because I have had other jobs as well. I've worked on, I think I've volunteered with 19 Cochrane groups, and I've been employed by 5 of them, I think.
Mm.
So it was so good. I mean, if it wasn't good, people wouldn't go for it.
No.
I mean, there was a recent unfortunate event that NIHR stopped funding the groups, and they started evidence synthesis grants rather than infrastructure grants. And I think 22 UK groups were affected by that. But I think the
Mm.
people who even left, they had no choice but to leave. They were able to secure other jobs because of the skills that they were carrying
Mm.
with them. So
Yes.
yeah, it is a fantastic role, and I think those of us who've been involved have been very lucky.
Mm.
That is the only thing that I could say. Until recently, that we have machine learning and artificial intelligence coming around, and they have made great progress. I'm closely following their development, and there are loads of tools emerging using large language models, retrieval-augmented generation, and they are good. I think I personally test them, and they are very good for mapping, scoping, snowballing. Do you think in the near future, or not so near future, we are going to have fully automated search without needing a search expert, or even without needing let's say search step at all?
Mm-hmm. As you say, I think these developments show great promise, but in the context of whether or not in the near future they will replace the skills required of a qualified search expert, I think I have to say that I don't think that's the case at the moment. Um, if we, I was reminded the other day that artificial intelligence isn't new. It's all of a sudden taken off in its own way over the last couple of years. But for many years now, we've been using things like predictive texting and things of this sort. And I think we have to bear in mind that artificial intelligence it's really guesswork, but guesswork based on high probability. So in the same way as with predictive texting, you would be very grateful if it kept coming up with the right answer because it saved you typing it in. And if it didn't come up with the right answer, it didn't matter because you just overtype it. But the problem with artificial intelligence when it's used, for example, to generate search strategies, the problem there is that it's less easy to see which bits it's got right and which bits it's got wrong. And that, I think, is the major difference. I text and use WhatsApp regularly in 2 different languages, in English and Spanish, and I don't speak Spanish very well. I've only been learning for about 4 or 5 years. So I'm enormously grateful to the, in inverted commas, artificial intelligence behind predictive texting, because those text suggestions are more likely to be right than I would have been by typing it in without these helpful suggestions. But I see it as being different within search strategy design, because within search strategy design, currently, I know better than the system. And that, I think, whilst the search experts know better than the system, and the system is simply generating the terms according to likelihood, I don't think we're far enough forward with this likelihood yet to make the search strategies reliable. And I think it might be helpful to use these systems for generating a first draft possibly, or to make sure that anything that, if you've done your own first draft, make sure there's nothing you have missed. I'm certainly not against them or feel that they shouldn't be used, but I just feel that we need to be careful at this point in time about relying upon them. In the same way as, going back to my example of predictive texting, I would not allow it to predict something for me in Spanish without me going back and checking it in case I had said something inappropriate.
And how about retrieval-augmented generation? Because now we could connect AI to a collection and ask for the documents from that collection. So some say that we actually could skip the search step now. From the Pico, we could directly retrieve the list of relevant documents. Do you think that is going to make more progress in the near future?
I'm not sure. Do you mean things like OpenAlex and so on? Is that what you have in mind, or?
Um, Not necessarily OpenAlex, but the technology that could use OpenAlex to get the relevant documents. And the reason that they can do that is that they could access to the full text, not just title and abstract. Because our problem with the search is that we have to be very sensitive to find the even slightly relevant ones, and then we have to screen them. And
Yes.
then the ones that we are not sure, we get the full text. But if we have access to all the full text from the beginning,
Yes.
then the system could be more accurate in finding the relevant documents.
Yeah, I think again, whether we're talking near future or far down the line, we need to go back a step and think about how might these documents appear, in how might it come to pass, let me put it that way to be totally clear, how might it come to pass that these full text documents might find themselves in such a system? Who's going to pay for that? Are we imagining paying, for example, all the subscriptions that you might pay as a library to the various journals to which you provide access? Would you, 50 years down the line, aggregate all those subscriptions and pay them into a central kind of system like you're talking about? But I think we have to bear in mind that everything comes with its cost.
Yes, that is very connected to what you mentioned about the cost and OpenAlex. So one of the troubles that we've got, and I think many people globally are suffering from, is the access to these sources, such as Embase. And we search multiple sources, it creates duplicates, then we have an extra step to remove the duplicates. And that's why there are sources such as OpenAlex, a one-stop shop. And if we could validate that actually searching OpenAlex is enough to capture all the information we need, it can easily replace. OpenAlex itself is free, but we probably have to pay for an API to access and search it. And do you think it's going to happen soon if we could get, because right now James Thomas and team are doing work at UCL showing that for the evidence gap and maps, it works very well and it gets all the required documents. It is likely that these maps are going to support living systematic reviews in the future.
Mm-hmm. Um, I think it's a difficult one, really. As you say, some sources appear to be expensive, but that's because they are expensive at the point of use, from our perception. So you give Embase as an example and Medline. Embase appears to be expensive at the point of use, whereas Medline is probably equally expensive, but paid for by the US taxpayer. So it's really a matter of perception. We think of Medline as being free, but Medline is not free. We are blessed by the US government. I know we're not getting into politics, but we are blessed by past regimes that have made Medline free to the world, which is an enormous gift from the US taxpayer to the rest of the world. But had they not done that, Medline would have been a charged database in the same way as Embase. although obviously it was within a government environment, it wasn't within the private sector. But this has shifted the balance and made us think that data such as Medline should be free, and data coming from Embase are expensive because we actually have to put our hands in our pocket and pay for it, or our institution does. And so I think that's something that we do need to remember.
Yes, thank you. So I'm getting slightly away from the information science questions and moving more towards the leadership now. And so you have been one of the leaders in our field, and we have seen many great teams, but their success is highly dependent on a single leader or a charismatic leader. As soon as the leader retires or leaves the organization or the team for any reason, the team starts to dissolve and disappear. Have you mentored other information professionals to take the lead on your other projects, like Cochrane Handbook, Chapter, or IRMG, or what's going to happen in case you retire? Have you mentored other people to take over the work?
Yeah, I think there are a number of different strands there. Yes, I have, and am still formally mentoring information specialists, but also I would say much more than mentoring. I've been involved in supporting information specialists in many, many ways, really ever since I first started in Cochrane. I would say really my first role in supporting bringing an information specialist into Cochrane, who, as I say, has gone on to do great things, is Steve McDonald. And so that was in something like 1994 or 1995. And since then, I've brought many, many people into Cochrane, either formally by being on their interview panel, or by informally enthusing them and encouraging them to join Cochrane, and so on, in different ways over the years. With regard to specific projects, the handbook chapter, some years ago, we very much broadened the co-authorship of the Cochrane Handbook, and the Cochrane Information Specialists Executive proposed a number of people that they would like to join as co-authors, and I also appointed one or two others. These were almost exclusively mid-career information specialists, with a view to longevity, because, as you say, it is a really important point. We can't have all the co-authors of the Cochrane Handbook being at my stage of their careers. That simply wouldn't work. So we're well covered with regard to the Cochrane Handbook. We now have about 10 co-authors. With regard to the Information Retrieval Methods Group, we're in the process of appointing a new convener, again, very specifically a mid-career information scientist. This we've announced on the Information Retrieval Methods Group list, and we've said that we will be specifically looking for somebody who is mid-career. The other projects I'm involved in, the Intertask Information Specialist Subgroup Search Filter Resource. Again, we broadened the editorial team some years ago. Julie and I had been responsible for that, together with Kath Wright from the Centre for Reviews and Dissemination. And when Kath retired some years ago, Julie and I decided that we needed to broaden that base again with mid-career information specialists, and we now have an editorial team of about 6. And the other project I'm heavily involved in is Sure.info, summarised research and information retrieval or something. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the title. We always call it Sure.info. But again, I was involved in that from the very, very beginning. We were quite a small group, but now there are dozens of authors in Sure.info. and many of them at the early career stage. So yes, I think it's really, really important as we progress in our careers to bring on the next generation. We can't just hoard it all for ourselves with no respect for what will happen when, for whatever reason, we are no longer here. I could get knocked down by a bus tomorrow. But I do feel that that I have made sure that I have brought enough people on board to keep the important things going.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the community, I thank you for taking this role and mentoring many people. 30 years of leadership in the field should have many great lessons. Would you please share some of the greatest lessons that you have had in your career with the younger generations?
I think one of the great lessons is that you have to be true to what you believe. And I think you must always speak out. I think whatever role you have and whatever position you have in the hierarchy, you have a responsibility to express your opinion, to ask questions, and to question what is happening around you. However, I also feel that that has to be tempered with the fact that if you are not the boss, which you most likely are not, you must accept and recognize that the final decision and the final level of responsibility rests with whoever your manager is. But I think that it's very, very important that all of us must question what we don't feel is appropriate or bring our perspective to the table. And I think if you feel that you're working in an environment where your perspective isn't welcomed and isn't honoured, then I think you need to be thinking about whether you should actually be working somewhere else. And as a manager, I think you should always make it clear to those that you are managing as you progress through the hierarchies, you should always make it clear to those you are managing that you do welcome their perspective. You do welcome their point of view. You do welcome differences of opinion, but you recognize that you, as the manager, have the responsibility for the final decision.
So, because we've got time, I could ask one surprise question that is not in the list, if you're okay with
I
it.
suspected that you would do that. I've just been wondering what it might be.
So, 1971, a librarian, Trudy Lamb, started clinical librarianship in Kansas. That is 20 years before the introduction of Cochrane introduction of evidence-based medicine. And she believed that the reference librarians should take the literature, should exit the library, go to the clinic, go to the clinical rounds, go to the morning reports, take the questions and find the evidence that answers those questions and present it to the clinicians. And that is 20 years before all of this happening. Why nobody knows about this? But everyone knows about Cochrane and start of evidence-based medicine in 1990s.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure it's, I mean, it might be that people don't know who it was who started it and that it was in 1971 and Kansas, but certainly clinical librarianship is alive and well. There's an International Clinical Librarians Conference every year or every 2 years in the UK, often in Leicester. And clinical librarianship is very, very strong. Certainly, as I say, in the UK, certainly within the academic community. So I don't think you need have any fears there. But as I say, those involved in it, in the same way as I know about the history of Cochrane because because I'm involved in it, but also because I was there, of course. But I'm sure that those who are involved in clinical librarianship would be aware of its history. But they are certainly supporting it. The clinical librarian community is a very strong community.
Carol, you have been very generous with your time and knowledge, and thank you for telling us a few of the stories to be recorded, hopefully forever. On behalf of the evidence synthesis community and information professionals community, we would like to thank you sincerely and wish you and your colleagues at Cochrane IRMG, Sure.info, Cochrane Handbooks, all the best. We hope to speak to you soon again. Thank you, Carol, and goodbye.
Thank you very much, Farhad. Thank you for the invitation. Goodbye.